Hi everybody, welcome to Dynamo Sword Channel. I'm David, and today on Dynamo Sword Channel I will be presenting the next video in my Oakeshott Typology series. This one on sword groups. Now, I gave a brief description on what sword groups are in the introduction video, but today we will go into the detail to understand why and for what reason swords of the Middle Ages were placed into two distinctive groups in the Oakeshott typology. So the reason for two groups was to separate the focus of use and design of the sword in the Middle Ages. There are two groups in the typology. Group 1, which focused on lanicular cross-section cut focused blades of the early Middle Ages, and Group 2, which focused on the thrusting and or cut and thrust focused blades with either diamond or hexagonal cross sections of the high and later Middle Ages. So what is the difference between these swords and why place them in two separate groups? Well, first, we probably should look back at the origin of Group 1 swords. To do this, we must go back to the early period of the Middle Ages, also known as the Viking Age or Carolingian Age. The early period arming swords, or Viking swords as they are more commonly known today, saw use between the 7th and 10th century. Now, these swords featured broad, parallel blades, flattened cross-section with complex or compact hilts featuring a lower and upper guard. Now, the primary use of these swords was to cut, and they were used with a shield for defense. Now, at the time, armor was, quite simple and hard to come by for the common soldier or man-at-arms, usually being a heavily padded gambeson, and for those that could afford it, chainmail. Now, the evolution of blade design was very minimal at this time, and it wasn't until the later 12th and 13th centuries that we see these swords evolve in blade design. Now, as metal armor became more readily available on the battlefield, the sword had to evolve to hold its function as a weapon. This is when we start to see blade profiles becoming more tapered and tips more acute, allowing swords to thrust more efficiently, though these swords did still keep their lanicular cross-section, well up into the later 14th century. So what is a lanicular cross-section, you might ask? Well, a lanicular cross-section would be described as a flat and or slightly rounded cross-section. Now, this cross-section allows a sword's blade to be broad and deal deadly dismembering cuts. Now, many of these swords had deep, wide fullers reaching up to about 7/8 of the blade's length. Now, these fullers help to reduce the weight of the overall sword, keeping it balanced and reducing fatigue of the user. We see fullers get thinner and shorter in later blade types of the group to help keep the blades more rigid for thrusting. As you can kind of see here how this one kind of ends here and it gives that more acute tip. So you have this nice thrusting section of the blade. But also in later war swords, swords were being able to be gripped with two hands. So then we see fullers also reduced to promote cutting power and to add a little weight and a higher point of balance for extra leverage. As you can see, many changes happened to the medieval sword in Group 1. First, we saw an evolution of the hilt from the compact Viking styles that, didn't really offer much hand protection, to the more elongated quillions, which had these swords dubbed as cruciform hilts. We also see the removal of that upper guard and replaced with more standard, solid oval or wheel pommel types. We also see blade design start to give focus to offering a tapering profile and a much more acute tip to promote thrusting. Then, as mentioned earlier, the evolution of the sword from a single-handed weapon to a more two-handed type of war sword known as, you know, with those war swords. I mean, we could discuss type, but it's a little early. But 12A, 13A, where you really see the two hand be used. Now, these primarily extended the blade length and grip length, allowing the user the ability to use two hands for greater reach, leverage, and of course, cutting power. Now, with the first sword type in Group 2, we will see a significant change in both cross-section and blades profile. So, we've kind of covered what classifies a sword to Group 1. So, what about Group 2? Just what were these significant changes? Well, for starters, the blades saw a significant change in profile taper, tapering to a more pronounced and acute sharp tip. This is also when we see a pronounced diamond cross section on medieval swords. Now, this cross section adds rigidity to the blade, allowing for strong, deadly thrusts to penetrate the lighter armors of the time, such as gambeson and mail, but also allowed a user to aim for gaps in plate armor, which was being introduced at the time. Now, the two-handed grips were also becoming more common, seeing use by civilian users and becoming what we would commonly dub long swords and also hand and a half swords. This was also a time of evolution to the design and profile of the medieval sword, with significant changes in types mingling with each other through the later half of the Middle Ages. From the thrust-focused first entry in Group 2, we see a merger of cutting and thrusting in the next. This is also the first time we will see the hexagonal cross section. Now, this cross section is defined by having a flat central section that sharply angles to the edge. Now, this cross section allowed a blade to retain an upper cross section to enhance cutting performance by strengthening the edges, but also allowed the blade to strongly taper, keeping an acute point for thrusting. We also see many blades with this cross section have a transition, which this sword is a prime example, from hexagonal to diamond at the midsection or about of the blade, creating what would be known as a cut and thrust blade profile. We also see a reprofiling of the diamond cross section into what is known as a hollow ground cross section. Now, a hollow ground cross section takes a diamond cross section and flattens the blade at the edges. This benefits the blade by retaining a strong central ridge or spine, but also contouring the edges, making them thinner and easier to cut with. This makes the blade able to retain its rigidness for thrusting while allowing the blade profile to be much more parallel, which of course adds to its cutting efficiency. Now you see much of these hologram blades gain prominence in popularity in the 15th century. Now, as we move down the group, we start to see a return to more hexagonal cross sections, but also the addition to another evolution to the medieval sword, the ricasso. So, just what is a ricasso? Well, a ricasso is a thick portion of the blade set at the base of the blade just above the guard. Now, the primary function of a ricasso is to strengthen the blade at the base, but in larger war swords or long swords of the late Middle Ages, it also added a place for the hand to grip the blade for when half swording techniques needed to be used, and also to promote stronger thrusting from the user. We also see fullering get a little more intricate and ornate in these later period swords, with many swords having double or triple fuller layouts, with many of these triple fullers having a unique pattern of two outer fullers reaching the end of the ricasso, with a main central fuller reaching the end of the ricasso, or going all the way up to about the middle point of the blade. These fullers benefited the sword's design, offering enough fuller for weight reduction, but also leaving enough of the blade at the last quarter of its length to allow rigidity for thrusting. Now, most of these later period war swords also feature more prominent hexagonal cross sections to promote their cutting efficiency, and are very similar in blade profile almost to earlier war swords of Group 1. Now, as you can see, Group 2 definitely has the edge when it comes to more intricate and developed design changes. A lot of that has to do with just them being at the later part of the Middle Ages, which means that there was a lot of trial error in design that led up to these later period swords. But still, I would think that it would be quite ignorant to overlook the significant changes that we're seeing in Group 1. As much of the evolution of the sword of the Middle Ages can definitely be seen in the later blades featured in Group 1. Now, regardless of which is your favorite, or what opinions might be on which one was superior, both groups still show a steady progression of the medieval sword through the hard work and ingenuity of medieval swordsmiths to develop purposeful and designed blade designs that not only combated the ever-evolving armors of the period, but also allowed versatility to the user and to swords themselves when it came to combating other weapons used on the battlefield of medieval Europe. Well, I hope you enjoyed this part 2 of my Oakeshott Typology series. Now be sure to check back soon for part 3 of the series, which will be on specific blade typologies, where again we will go into more detail on each individual blade type and, of course, the subtypes. Also, be sure to like, subscribe, and share in support of the channel, as well as look for other future content from Dynamo Sword Channel. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.